Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Maisel and it is time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible, I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. In turn, the gear I suggest will allow for high damage and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. That usually also means that the build is not necessarily always the best in slot choice, but it will pass a certain DPS threshold on the usual raid buffs and get you through pretty much all open world content on your own if needed. Today's class is the Revenant and the elite specialization is the Renegade. In this video I'm going to cover 3 different build types, an open world roamer, a conditioned DPS and a righteous rebel support variant, and all of those will only use one specific weapon, the Shortbow. Before we go into the details, some pros and cons though. The build is almost fully ranged with Shortbow.
It has great sustain capabilities when using the Devastation trait line.
It does great DPS with a very simple rotation, and it also has good support capabilities through might sharing, Alacrity, decent amounts of CC and vulnerability. In my opinion, the only downside it has is that the gear it uses is pretty expensive. Alright, without further ado, let's dive into the build. Revenants are, together with Thieves, the only profession in the game that has a resource bar to manage that also determines how fast you can use skills and slowly regenerates over time. On this class, different skills have different energy costs. This leads to some skills being very powerful with very short cooldowns, more so than in other classes possibly, but the energy bar restricts your ability to use them severely because they usually have a high energy cost as the main trade-off. The only way to regain energy aside from the slow base regeneration is to swap legends. You can swap legends every 10 seconds, which will replace your entire utility skill bar and is not affected by Alacrity. In the beginning when starting this class, this dynamic can feel pretty restrictive and kind of annoyed me when I first played it. But after you get used to it, it makes the class one of the most enjoyable and powerful ones to choose, which is why I use it for most solo content and in raids nowadays.
On Conditioned Renegade, the 2 best legends to go with are Malix and Color.
Renegades as the elite specialization of choice gain access to Citadel Order abilities and the unique buff Color's Fervor, referring to the legend Color Scorch Razor, which happens to be great for both Condi and power builds. The 3 Citadel Order abilities you can find straight above your weapon skills. Let's talk about Color's Fervor and then discuss the Citadel Order skills one by one. Color's Fervor is a stacking buff with a maximum of 5 stacks that grants 2% to all damage per stacks, so 10% maximum by default. You can use the Renegade abilities to empower this and gain easier access to stacks, but more on that later. Heroic Command is the first Citadel Order skill. This grants you and allies around you 2 stacks of might for every stack of Color's Fervor you have, so a maximum of 10 stacks. With a trait Lasting Legacy, you can increase that to 15 stacks. In group content where might is provided, this isn't really useful, but in solo situations this is a cheap way to apply a ton of might to yourself, so you don't need to use any sigil for it. Next up we have Citadel Bombardment.
This skill is very powerful in AoE scenarios, but it's better to prioritize Razor Claw's Rage in group scenarios because it has a higher damage to energy ratio. A skill that is essential for the Alacrity variant is Orders from Above. It grants you and your subgroup 1.5 seconds of Alacrity each second for 4 seconds at a relatively low cost. In the Alacrity support build, we're using the Righteous Rebel trait to extend this to 6 seconds so that you can provide Alacrity with the right gear very easily.
Let's move on to weapon skills. The only weapon we'll be using in all build variants is the Shortbow.
Shortbow is one of the strongest ranged weapons you can find in the entire game.
While you can reach higher DPS numbers with an additional mace and axe, Shortbow alone is the easiest way to reach good damage with low effort and thus has a great return on investment. With the trait choices we made, all Shortbow skills also pierce and can therefore affect multiple targets. The auto attack Shatter Shot is pretty basic. It applies bleeding and does a little strike damage. It's also a physical projectile finisher for combo fields. Shatter Shot is a repeated single attack, which makes Shortbow very straightforward to play since you don't need to watch for an interruption of a pretty backloaded auto attack chain. Next up, Bloodbane Path also applies bleeding and has a very low cost. Spam this on cooldown, it does a lot for what it costs. The same thing can be said about 7 Shot, the most ludicrously powerful skill in the kit. It applies 7 stacks of Torment not only on the target but also to enemies standing around it when they get hit by the arrows. As if that wasn't enough, each arrow is also a 20% chance projectile finisher for combo fields. One of the combo fields you can use for this is Spirit Crush. It applies slow, several stacks of burning in a circular targeted AoE. The damage is good enough to use it off cooldown, especially since you can use the combo field for additional stacks of burning from both 7-shot and auto attacks. Finally, Scorch Razor has a relatively low damage trader for the CC it applies, so it's a very good way to provide CC from range on several targets. Alright, moving towards utilities slash legends. The primary legend of usage is Color Scorch Razor. This legend is awesome because it allows you to deal great damage, CC and have high self-healing while completely staying at range. The other legend, Malix, forces you into melee, but more on that when we get to it. The 4 utility skills are all NPCs that are actually targetable by enemies. This can be seen as both positive and negative, since bosses can interrupt or kill them before they fulfill their full potential, but they also take aggro away from you from time to time. The heal skill is Break Razor's Bastion. It costs almost nothing and does everything you want from a healing skill aside from Condi cleanse. It has a good initial heal, a pulsing AoE heal for 5 allies around you, and also reduces Condi damage taken by 50% for 10 seconds while you or your allies stay inside the circle. After that we got Razor Claw's Rage. The skill makes you and your subgroup apply bleeding on strikes on a 1-second interval. This skill is the reason why benchmarks for Renegades are a little understated. The stacks of bleeding applied by this skill count as your damage, which is why this adds quite a bit of DPS on top of those benchmarks. Razor Claw's Rage is the #1 priority in group content, but it's not as strong as DPS on your own or on the Golem for what it costs, so I often replace this by Citadel Bombardment, Ice Razor's Ire or Dark Razor's Daring depending on the situation. Ice Razor's Ire is not a condition focused skill, but it's nonetheless a very powerful tool, especially with Devastation slotted. It applies 20 stacks of vulnerability in full AoE, meaning that it will grant you stacks of battle scars for every single stack in case you have Dance of Death slotted. More on this later when we talk about traits. Moving on to Dark Razor's Daring. Similar to the other color skills, this is incredibly powerful but also has a quite high cost. The damage it does isn't great, but it has unparalleled CC over its duration since it dazes up to 5 targets per second for 6 seconds. It also grants you 1 stack of stability on initial hit and breaks stuns, so this is basically an oh shit button that you can also use for CC. The elite skill Soul Cleave Summit isn't that interesting for us. It does allow you and your allies to steal health and adds a nice chunky heal for your subgroup, but it also constantly drains your energy while doing that, severely restricting your option to use other skills while in color. Only use this when you know your group is going to need additional healing, which should basically never happen. The second legend of choice is the legendary Demon Stance, inspired by Malix the Unyielding. None of the utility skills aside from the elite will be used most of the time. I still talk about them because they do have some niche utility. Malix is the main condition damage legend that, when paired with color, allows you to have access to pretty much everything you could ever want, even though you will rarely need it. The heal skill is pretty basic. It heals you and adds another heal for every condition you have. It does not cleanse them off, so keep that in mind. That is particularly relevant when we look at Pain Absorption, which draws conditions from allies around you onto you. You should never really use this skill, only as a last resort whenever you need to break a stun in Malix, especially since it has a really chunky energy cost. Banish Enchantment is a boon removal skill in a beam shape that can hit multiple targets and chills foes. Boon removal can be useful in some encounters like Veil Guardian, even though you should be assigned to the red one anyway as Condi DPS, or Kadim the Peerless. Call to Anguish is a leap finisher that chills enemies and pulls them towards your landing point. It does good CC and will cause you to gain Dark Aura when you activate it after the elite skill. Dark Aura applies torment to enemies that strike you, which in turn will heal you. The most important skill for damage is Embrace the Darkness. This is an upkeep skill that would slowly but constantly drain your energy. While you keep this up, you apply torment to enemies around you every 1 second. If you use a skill that costs energy, so everything besides the auto attack, it will apply 2 additional stacks of torment. That is why you do not want to always use skills in quick succession in Malix, so that as many pulses of this as possible gain the additional stacks of torment. Just try to fill the gaps between the 3 main Shortbow skills 2 to 4 with auto attacks and delay them a little, it is definite. Moving on to gear choices. The gear attribute is all Viper, because that's the standard in group content. There's no real reason to use anything else on Condi Renegade since you can achieve all the defense or support you need through trades and consumable items. If you feel like running full Viper is too squishy for you, you can exchange a few large pieces like the amulet, chest or weapons for Trailblazers or Ritualist pieces. Trailblazer sacrifices burst through lower strike damage for a ton of toughness and vitality,
while Ritualist sacrifices the strike damage for a ton of vitality and boon duration, which is also great for the Alacrity support build, so it synergizes well with that. The two conditions that are responsible for the highest share of your damage are Torment and Bleeding, so maximizing the condition duration on those is the highest priority. And the Nightmare rune greatly helps with that because it has the highest individual condition duration as a rune that you can get. The currency you need for Nightmare runes can be farmed in any kind of explorable dungeon path, so that's pretty easy to get. If you want some guidance on farming the gear for this efficiently, I also have a video on that. As for sigils, I run 2 shortbows in all content, one with Earth and Torment sigils and one with Cleansing and Energy. The shortbow with damaging sigils is the standard weapon for all content, while the other one is the emergency weapon swap that allows you to cleanse Condis and restore endurance on demand. This build does not have any way to cleanse conditions otherwise and a fairly slow endurance recovery. In terms of consumables, I always run the meaty asparagus skewer and the toxic focusing crystal. If you can afford it, you can also run the Writ of Master Formelis in group content for a slight increase of your Condi damage compared to the toxic focusing crystal. Alright, now that we got gear covered, let's move on to specializations and traits. As always, I won't go through every trait in detail, just the ones that have an impact on the playstyle in open world or the damaging rotation. The specializations for this build are pretty much set in stone. We'll be using Corruption, Invocation and of course Renegade. You can also use Devastation instead of Invocation for higher self-healing, which is particularly helpful for clearing harder open world content on your own. Just make sure to use Ice Razor's Ire often enough to apply tons of vulnerability on enemies to heal yourself. Let's start with Corruption. Corruption is the go-to specialization for Condi builds. It grants increased Condi damage, 25% longer duration on damaging conditions, 10% increased torment damage, and applies 3 different conditions around you whenever you swap legends. The latter effect that triggers when you swap legends is called Invoke Torment and is the reason why you want to swap legend as soon as possible, aside from the energy gain. The second standard specialization is Invocation. It gives higher damage while you have Fury, applies might to yourself whenever you gain Fury, grants you Fury when swapping legends or when disabling enemies. This synergizes very well with Dark Razor's Daring, by the way. It further applies conditions upon swapping legends, similarly to Invoke Torment in the Corruption trait line. Note that the benchmark rotation uses Charged Mists for more energy, but that increases the complexity of the rotation noticeably, so we use Song of the Mists instead. This grants you another few stacks of Torment and Bleeding and does more damage than Roiling Mists on the Condi variant. Finally, Renegade is the elite specialization. Overall, the middle trait line is the best for Condi DPS builds. It will increase your bleeding duration by 25% while you have Fury, grant you Fury when you strike low health enemies, increase your bleeding damage by 25%, and it makes your shortbow skills pierce so that they can hit multiple targets. It also increases your crit chance by a whopping 33% while your endurance is full. On the Grandmaster level, Lasting Legacy is the standard choice because it increases all damage you deal and makes Heroic Command apply more might around you. You can also go with Vindication in case you want a passive source of might instead of an active one, but it usually isn't needed. The other option for the Grandmaster trait is Righteous Rebel, which brings me to how to provide Alacrity. Condition Alacrity Renegade has the advantage that it is very simple to provide Alacrity on it. You just need to press one button every 16 seconds, as orders from above will pulse Alac to your allies enough that way. It can also provide quite a bit of might to allies through Heroic Command and a bit of resistance and resolution if you decide to go with Spirit Boon instead of Incensed Response. It does have downsides though. Downsides are that it does not provide other essential boons like Fury, Aegis, Stability, Regeneration or Vigor. That said, it is best used when accompanied by a subgroup that already covers most boons. Another issue is that it needs a relatively high amount of boon duration to work well, which you can basically only obtain by putting on an almost full set of Ritualist gear and dedicated runes that include boon duration as well. And since there are no useful boon duration runes for Condi builds, like runes that increase Alacrity duration, you make quite the compromise for being able to provide Alac. So I see this as more of a gimmicky build whenever you have a lot of resources or legendary gear already. The rotation doesn't change much, but you always have to prioritize orders from above before you cast any other skills so you maintain Alacrity. Speaking of rotation, let's talk about the DPS rotation in the final section of the video. First and foremost, it is a simplified rotation that will net you good DPS, so around 32k on your own, but not as much as the benchmark. It is tailored to easy clears, high win rates and harder content and straightforward execution. Also note that due to the effect of Razor Claw's bleeding applied by allies, you need to add a chunk of DPS on top that isn't applied in solo testing. We will use Shortbow at all times, and you only need to swap to the other Shortbow in open world when you need Condi Cleanse or additional endurance for dodges. The opening is pretty simple. In group content I always start in Kala and cast Citadel Bombardment and Scorched Razor and then swap immediately to Malex. Then after the swap, immediately activate Embrace the Darkness. This is always step number 1 in Malex because it will make you pulse Torment and additional Torment when you use Shortbow 2, 3 and 4. It is also a dark combo field that will trigger lifesteal if you use projectile finishers inside of it. Try to delay the casts of the Shortbow skills by squeezing an auto attack so that every skill benefits from the additional Torment. You can only increase the Torment stacks once per second. You should be able to use Shortbow 2 thrice and 3 and 4 once per Malex. As soon as you can, swap back to Kala. Generally, priority number 1 are legend swaps. You almost always want to do them on cooldown so you gain the extra energy and trigger Invoke Torment and Song of the Mists. In Kala, the first thing you want to do is use Citadel Bombardment or Razorclaw. Then use Shortbow 2, 3, 4 on cooldown and use Citadel Bombardment or another Razorclaw whenever it's available. The difference between them isn't large, but in group content it can be worth delaying going back to Malex for a second cast of Razorclaw. In case you are forced to be ranged for a longer period of time, for example on solo, harder content or bounties, stay in Kala. Malex forces you in melee range for Embrace the Darkness and Invoke Torment, so it isn't really worth going there when you are at range. Just cast the Shortbow skills as usual and then use the 3 utilities in Kala based on your requirements. For CC you have several options. The combination of Dark Razor and Scorched Razor on top will break CC bars quickly without a large damage loss, so I usually favor this combination over the other options you have in Malex. Should you need quick CC in Malex, use Call to Anguish and Scorched Razor instead. This rotation is pretty simple and loops well. It doesn't require you to micromanage auto attack chains, weapon swaps or anything fancy like weapon stows, and will get you through everything up to challenge mode fractals and harder rate bosses. It is one of my favorite builds for all content and I still use it for solo gameplay more than any other build. Alright, that is it for today. I hope this video was insightful for you and made you want to try Condition Renegade. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm and good luck containing the demon.